Welcome back to Draven's Den. I am Dravin, and I know it's been a couple of weeks. I had to take some time off and focus on my new job. By trade, I'm a carpenter. I have been doing that for over 30 years, and I've built houses, built American dreams, and done a lot of stuff, you know. But I keep coming back to this. I come back to this because I think that America needs to remember its past. It needs to remember where it came from to understand where it's going. I had a saying at one point that said, understanding where you came from gives you a good roadmap to your future. And I still hold that as being true. But it is official. America is 250 years old. And I mean, if you stop and think about that, that's a pretty damn long time. It's not the longest because if you really think about it, we're still infants on this planet. Europe has a much longer history than we do. But we're not talking about Europe tonight. We're talking about America. And we're talking about how it started. And I think everyone needs to understand exactly how it started. So it's just after midnight on July 4th, 2026. America. 250 years. Tonight, fireworks will be bursting over small towns and big cities. Families will be laughing around backyard cookouts. Children are waving sparklers in the humid summer air. I mean, holy crap. We're during an El Nino, and the heat this year is absolutely freaking crazy. But somewhere, a little boy will be seeing fireworks for the very first time. Somewhere, an elderly veteran will be hearing the sounds of the fireworks, and it'll take him back to when he lost his best friend. These are the things that you need to remember. Somewhere, there's a 911 dispatcher answering calls from the most ridiculous of situations. Somewhere, there's a police officer that's going to be beginning his shift or her shift. A nurse will be making her rounds. A truck driver will be crossing another state line. A young soldier will be standing watch thousands of miles away from home. A mother will be rocking a newborn baby to sleep. Life. It continues. And that's, that's part of the miracle. Because 250 years ago, none of this was guaranteed. It was a bet. The country wasn't guaranteed, the Constitution, not the freedoms we often take for granted. In fact, if you had been alive in the summer of 1776, you probably would have bet against what we have today. You would have bet against America. That's how uncertain it was. You probably would have bet against America existing at all. Think about that. The British Empire controlled nearly a quarter of the known world. Its navy ruled the seas. Its army was among the most disciplined on Earth. The 13 colonies, they weren't even united. They argued. They disagreed. They had different economies, different religions, different priorities, and different ideas about what the future should look like. There was no certainty, no blueprint, no guarantee, only an idea. And history has taught us something remarkable. Ideas are stronger than empires. So tonight, during the first hour of America's 250th birthday, I'd like to tell you a story. Not of a perfect nation, because there has never been one, but of an extraordinary experiment. One that changed the world. Welcome to Dravin's Den. Long before there were 50 stars on the flag, before there was a White House, before there was a Constitution, there were simply colonies, 13 of them. And stretching along the Atlantic coast is where they were. Most people considered themselves British subjects. They drank British tea, read British newspapers, sang British songs. If someone had asked a Virginia farmer in 1765 where he was from, he probably wouldn't have answered America. He would have answered Virginia. Or perhaps, I'm an Englishman. Because that's exactly what he believed. Few people were talking about independence. Most simply wanted fairness. They wanted the same rights employed by citizens living in England. Nothing more, nothing less. But history rarely changes all at once. It changes one decision, one law, one mistake at a time. The 7 Years' War had left Britain deeply in debt. Wars were expensive. Damn expensive. Empires, even more so. Parliament looked across the Atlantic and saw 13 prosperous colonies. Surely, they could help pay the bill. So came the Stamp Act. Legal documents, newspapers, licenses, even playing cards now carried taxes. Then came the Townshend Act. Then the Tea Act. The taxes themselves weren't enormous. That's the surprising part. It wasn't really about money. It was about something far more dangerous. Control. The colonists had no representation in Parliament. Yet Parliament continued making decisions that affected every aspect of colonial life. The phrase became famous. No taxation without representation. But underneath those 5 words lived a much larger question. Who has the right to govern free people? That's the question that would eventually change the world. December 16th, 1773. A cold night settled over Boston Harbor. 3 ships floated quietly in the water. Their cargo? Nothing but tea. Hundreds of chests of it. Members of the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians. Not to mock Native Americans, but to conceal their identities from British authorities. Then they climbed aboard. One chest after another crashed into the harbor. 342 chests, nearly 46 tons of tea thrown into the sea. Not stolen, not destroyed. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't vandalism. It was a political rebellion. Britain answered harshly. Boston Harbor was closed. Massachusetts lost much of its self-government. British troops increased its presence. The colonies watched carefully. Many realized something was very unsettling. If Britain could do this to Massachusetts, it could do it to anyone. Suddenly, 13 separate colonies began thinking of themselves as one people. April 19th, 1775. Before sunrise, British troops marched towards Lexington. Their mission seemed straightforward: confiscate colonial weapons, arrest Samuel Adams, arrest John Hancock. In the rebellion before it truly began, waiting for them, stood 77 colonial militiamen, farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, ordinary people. Captain John Parker gave a simple order: stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have war, let it begin here. Then a gunshot. No one knows who fired first. Historians have debated about it for more than 2 centuries. We may never know. There's absolutely no way we could ever know. But one thing is for certain. That single shot echoed far behind and beyond Lexington Green. It echoed through history itself. 8 colonists died. British troops pushed onward toward Concord. Along the road, everything changed. Militia fighters fired from behind stone walls, trees, and barns. The British weren't fighting a traditional army anymore. They were fighting an idea. By day's end, nearly 300 British soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. The revolution had begun, whether anybody wanted it or not. 1 year later, Pennsylvania, July 1776. The room inside Pennsylvania State House was stifling. Windows stood open despite the heat. Horses clattered across the cobblestone streets outside. Inside, men argued over every sentence. Thomas Jefferson drafted the first version. Benjamin Franklin revised it. John Adams defended it with relentless determination. This wasn't simply another political document. It was the birth certificate of a nation. And if it failed, their death warrant. King George II King George III wouldn't see statesmen. He would see traitors. The punishment for treason wasn't prison. Wasn't exile. it was execution. These men understood that. John Hancock signed first, large, bold. Whether or not he actually wanted the king to read his name without spectacles. The signature certainly left little doubt about his commitment. One by one, 56 men placed everything they owned, their fortunes, their reputations, their families, their very lives, behind a single idea. Not that America already existed, but that it should. When Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," he wasn't describing the world as it was. He was describing the world as it ought to be. Those words became more than the foundation of one nation. They inspired revolutions across the globe. Not immediately, not perfectly, but permanently. For the first time in history, a nation declared that governments existed because people allowed them to exist, not because kings said so. Not because birth determined destiny. Not because human beings possessed rights simply by existing. It was an outrageous idea, a dangerous idea, a beautiful idea, and it changed the course of civilization. The Declaration of Independence was signed. The words were written, the ink still drying. But words don't win wars. Britain didn't receive the Declaration and simply say, "Oh, well then, best of luck." Quite the opposite. King George III considered the Declaration an act of rebellion. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, only war. The 13 colonies had just challenged the greatest military power the world had ever known. Imagine standing in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776. Would you have believed America could actually win? Most people didn't. Britain possessed nearly 50,000 professional soldiers. The Royal Navy controlled the oceans. Its empire stretched around the globe. The colonies had farmers, merchants, blacksmiths, teachers, hunters, men who had never marched in formation. Many supplied their own weapons. Some didn't even have shoes. Others carried old hunting rifles instead of military muskets. Congress had declared independence, but it still struggled to pay its own soldiers. Food was scarce. Gunpowder was scarce. Money was scarce. Hope sometimes was scarce. History remembers the victories. I mean, the victors often write the stories. But it often forgets just how close America came to disappearing. George Washington never claimed to be a military genius. In fact, he lost more battles than he won. That surprises many people. We tend to remember Washington as the victorious general. But during the Revolution, victory was anything but guaranteed. The British drove his army from New York, forced retreat after retreat. Many believed the revolution was already over. Thomas Paine would later write, "These are the times that try men's souls." He wasn't exaggerating. By the winter of 1776, Washington's army was exhausted. Enlistments were expiring. Men deserted. Some simply went home. Many had no coats. Some wrapped rags around their feet because their shoes had completely worn away. Every step through the snow left streaks of blood behind them. Disease spread faster than enemy bullets. Food was so scarce that soldiers sometimes survived on little more than flour mixed with water. And yet, Washington refused to surrender. Because he understood something many military commanders never learn. Sometimes, the objective isn't winning every battle. Sometimes, it's surviving long enough to win the war. Christmas night, December 25th. Most of the world celebrated Christmas. Washington prepared for something entirely different. A desperate gamble. The Delaware River was swollen with ice. The weather was miserable. Snow mixed with freezing rain. Many officers argued that crossings should be canceled. Washington disagreed. Throughout the night, small boats ferried soldiers across the icy river. Men shivered in soaked uniforms. Cannons were dragged through the mud and ice. The operation fell behind schedule almost immediately. If the Hessian soldiers stationed in Trenton discovered them, everything could collapse. But they didn't. Just after sunrise, Washington attacked. The battle lasted less than an hour. Nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers were captured. American casualties were astonishingly light. Militarily, Trenton wasn't a massive battle. Psychologically, it changed everything. The revolution suddenly seemed possible again. Hope returned. Sometimes, history turns because one leader chooses to act while everyone else is waiting for better circumstances. Valley Forge. If Trenton restored hope, Valley Forge tested it. The winter of 1777 and 1778 became one of the darkest chapters of the Revolution. Nearly 12,000 soldiers entered the encampment. They built crude log cabins. They lacked blankets, medicine, proper clothing, smallpox, typhus, influenza. Disease swept through the camp. By spring, more than 2,000 soldiers were dead. Not from combat, but from exposure, hunger, illness. Imagine the conversations around the campfires. Men wondered whether Congress had forgotten them, whether independence was worth this suffering, whether they would ever see home again. Washington stayed. He shared the hardship. He visited hospitals. He rode through camp. He listened. Leadership isn't simply standing at the front during the victory, it's remaining present during despair. Valley Forge transformed more than morale. It transformed the army itself. A former Prussian officer named uh, Baron Frederick von Steuben, he arrived. He introduced standardized training, discipline, organization, drill. The Continental Army stopped looking like 13 separate militias. It became one army, one nation, before there truly was one. And this is when the world took notice. For nearly 2 years, America fought alone. France watched carefully. So did Spain. So did the Netherlands. Everyone wanted to know the answer to one question. Could these colonies actually survive? Then came Saratoga, October 1777. American forces surrounded an entire British army under General John Burgoyne. Burgoyne? All right, you guys know me with pronunciations. More than 5,000 British troops surrendered. Europe, they paid attention. France reached a remarkable conclusion. Maybe these Americans actually had a chance. In 1778, France officially entered the war. Money, ships, soldiers, supplies. Most importantly, a navy capable of challenging Britain. Without French support, American independence becomes much harder to imagine. History is rarely shaped by one nation alone. It's shaped by alliances, by timing, by opportunities seized at exactly the right moment. Yorktown. By 1781, the war had dragged on for 6 exhausting years. British General Charles Cornwallis established defenses around Yorktown, Virginia. He expected support from the Royal Navy. Instead, French warships blocked the Chesapeake Bay. Washington saw an opportunity. American and French forces surrounded Yorktown. For weeks, artillery pounded British defenses. Day after day, night after night, eventually, the impossible happened. Cornwallis surrendered. The image became legendary. British soldiers marched out as their military band reportedly played. The world turned upside down. Whether that tune was actually played remains debated by historians. But the symbolism couldn't be more fitting. The world had indeed been turned upside down. An empire had been defeated, not by another empire, but by ordinary citizens who believed government should answer to the people. History remembers George Washington for defeating Britain. I think his greatest accomplishment happened after the war, when it was over. Many expected Washington to become king. Seriously. Some officers wanted it. Others quietly suggested it. After all, that's how history usually worked. Victorious generals became rulers. Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar. Okay, that's funny. I don't care where you're from. Julius Caesar. Caesar. Oh my God. Okay, yeah. Julius Caesar. I'm sorry, I'm not editing that out. That's just funny. Napoleon, countless others. Power was rarely surrendered voluntarily. Instead, on December 23rd, 1783, George Washington walked into the Maryland State House in Annapolis. He stood before Congress. He resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Then he went home. King George III reportedly said that if Washington truly surrendered power and returned to private life, and I quote, he will be the greatest man in the world, unquote. Think about why that mattered. The revolution wasn't fought to replace one king for another. It was fought to prove something entirely different. That power belonged to the people, not the man holding the sword. Years later, Washington would become America's first president. And once again, after 2 terms, he voluntarily stepped away. There was no law requiring him to. He simply believed no one person should hold power forever. That decision shaped the future of democracy more than almost any battle ever fought. Because true greatness isn't measured by, how much power someone gains. Sometimes it's measured by the power they're willing to give away. But the war wasn't over. The war was over. America was free. But independence was only the beginning. So I guess, in a sense, the war wasn't over. Because I'll be honest with you. I was born in 1975, and here it is, 2026. And we're still fighting a war. You got, and yeah, I'm going to segue a little bit. You got the Republicans and the Democrats, and they're just constantly going at each other's throats, and it's a different kind of war. If you guys really want to know, my standpoint is this. Make crap affordable again. That's it. You know what? You want to argue with each other? Yeah, knock yourself out. All you're doing is creating more issues. Focus on affordability. I don't care who you are. I don't care what you represent. Focus on affordability. All right, that's my 2 cents. But again, independence was only the beginning. Now came a question no nation had ever successfully answered for very long. Could ordinary people govern themselves? Yeah, that kind of plays in, right? The next chapter of the American experiment would prove every bit as difficult as winning the revolution itself. The Republic, if you can keep it. When the last British soldier sailed away, the real work began. Winning a revolution was one thing. Keeping a republic alive was something history had rarely seen. The 13 former colonies were now independent states. Each had its own interest, its own economy, its own identity. Some believed the federal government should remain weak. Others feared that without a stronger national government, the country would simply fall apart. The Articles of Confederation, America's first attempt at governing itself, had served their purpose during the Revolution, but they were proving inadequate for peace. Congress couldn't effectively collect taxes. It couldn't regulate trade between the states. It couldn't even guarantee payment to the soldiers who had won the nation's independence. America had defeated the greatest empire on earth, only to find itself struggling to govern 13 quarrelsome states. Something had to change. So in the summer of 1787, delegates gathered once again in Philadelphia. Officially, they were there to revise the Articles of Confederation. Instead, they quietly decided to build something entirely new. Imagine the scene. The windows of Independence Hall were nailed shut despite the sweltering summer heat. The delegates wanted secrecy. Outside, ordinary citizens had no idea that inside those walls, a handful of men were debating ideas that would shape the next 2.5 centuries. George Washington presided over the convention. James Madison took meticulous notes that historians still rely upon today. Benjamin Franklin, now 81 years old, brought humor and wisdom to a room often filled with tension. Kind of sounds like me. Ha! They argued constantly. Large states wanted more representation. Small states feared being ignored. Some delegates believed the president should serve for life. Others feared creating another king. They debated how power should be divided. They debated about how laws should be made, how rights should be protected. No one left that room completely satisfied. Not a single one of them. And perhaps that's exactly why the Constitution has endured. It wasn't built on perfect agreement. It was built on compromise. When the convention ended, a woman reportedly asked Benjamin Franklin what kind of government the delegates had created. Franklin's answer remains one of the most famous observations in American history. A republic, if you can keep it. Notice what he didn't say. He didn't say if the politicians can keep it. He didn't say if the military can keep it. He said if you can keep it. Even then, the founders understood something that still rings true today. Freedom isn't self-sustaining. Every generation must choose whether to preserve it. The young republic expanded quickly. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson made one of the boldest dedications and decisions in American history. He purchased the Louisiana Territory from France. More than 800,000 square miles for $15 million. At the time, many thought it was absurd. Some argued Jefferson had exceeded the constitutional authority. Others wondered why anyone would want so much wilderness. Today, it remains one of the greatest land purchases in history. It doubled the size of the United States overnight. But Jefferson wanted more than land. He wanted knowledge. So he commissioned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore the vast territory stretching towards the Pacific Ocean. For over 2 years, the Corps of Discovery crossed mountains, rivers, and plains few Americans had ever seen. They mapped the landscape, documented hundreds of new plant and animal species, established relationships with Native American tribes, and were asked by one of history's most remarkable women, Sacagawea. Still in her teens, carrying an infant son on her back for much of the journey, she served as interpreter, guide, and symbol of peaceful intent. Without her, the expedition may have never succeeded. Their journey wasn't simply exploration. It expanded America's understanding of the continent itself. During the 1800s, America transformed itself. Railroads stitched the continent together. The first transcontinental railroad, completed in 1869, linked the Atlantic and Pacific in ways previously unimaginable. A journey that once took months could now be completed in days. Towns sprang up almost overnight. Industries flourished. Farmers could sell crops farther than ever before. Families separated by thousands of miles could remain connected. Then came another revolution: communication. In 1844, Samuel Morse sent the first long-distance telegraph message. What hath God wrought? For the first time in human history, information could travel faster than a horse. That single invention shrank the world. Soon after Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, imagine hearing the voice of someone miles away. Today, we barely think about it. Then, seemed almost magical. For thousands of years, when the sun went down, life slowed. Candles, lanterns, fireplaces. Darkness was simply part of being human. Then came Thomas Edison. Now, it's important to be accurate. Edison did not invent the light bulb. Others had created earlier versions. What Edison accomplished was something arguably more important. He developed a practical, affordable lighting system that ordinary people could actually use. His laboratories improved the incandescent bulb, created electrical distribution systems, and helped establish the first electric power stations. For the first time, entire neighborhoods glowed after sunset. Factories could, operate longer. Hospitals became safer. Families could read at night without relying on smoky oil lamps. It changed everyday life in ways difficult for us to imagine because we've never known a world without electric light. And then we conquered the sky. For thousands of years, people dreamed of flying. The Wright brothers turned that dream into reality. Wilbur and Orville Wright weren't wealthy industrialists. They owned a bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio. They studied birds, built gliders, made countless mistakes. Then on December 17th, 1903, at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, Orville Wright piloted the first successful powered flight. It lasted only 12 seconds, covered just 120 feet. But those 12 seconds changed civilization. Within decades, mail crossed continents by air. Families traveled across oceans. Medical helicopters saved lives. And eventually, humans would use lessons learned from those fragile aircraft to leave the planet itself. Never underestimate what can grow from 12 seconds of success. Now, you have the arsenal of democracy. The 20th century also brought unimaginable challenges. Twice, the world descended into global war. The United States did not seek either conflict, but once involved, it transformed itself with astonishing speed. During World War II, American factories became legendary. Automobile plants built tanks. Typewriter companies manufactured rifles. Shipyards launched Liberty ships faster than the enemy could sink them. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of millions of women entering the factories to support the war effort. Families planted victory gardens, collected scrap metal, bought war bonds. Everyone contributed. President Franklin Roosevelt called America the arsenal of democracy. And history proved him right. When Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, they carried not only weapons made in America, but hope. Hope that tyranny could be defeated. Hope that democracy would survive. The cost was staggering. More than 400,000 Americans lost their lives during World War II. Yet their sacrifice helped liberate millions. And then there was a giant leap. Then came perhaps the most extraordinary achievement in human history: the moon. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy challenged the nation to land a man on the moon before the decade ended. At the time, America had barely begun sending astronauts into space. The goal seemed impossible. Yet more than 400,000 people worked on the Apollo program. Engineers, scientists, machinists, programmers, mathematicians, many whose names history never recorded. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong climbed down the ladder of the lunar module Eagle. He stepped onto the moon. Millions watched in disbelief. The words he spoke became immortal. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Notice, he didn't say a giant leap for America. He understood that everyone watching also understood this wasn't merely an American triumph. It was a human one. For the first time in history, people from Earth stood on another world. And suddenly, the impossible seemed a little smaller. For 250 years, America has stumbled, succeeded, invented, sacrificed, argued, improved, and kept moving forward. But perhaps America's greatest accomplishment isn't found in its inventions or its victories or even its constitution. Perhaps it's found in its people. Because in the end, history isn't written by nations. It's written by ordinary men and women whose names may never appear in history books, but whose lives shape the future every single day. History has an interesting way of humbling us. Every generation believes it's living in the most important time. Every generation thinks it has finally figured everything out. Then time passes. And history reminds us that there is always more work to do. The men who signed the Declaration of Independence believed deeply in liberty. Yet many of them lived in a world where everyone were not allowed to enjoy liberty equally. That contradiction would haunt America for generations. But here's something remarkable. Instead of abandoning the ideas written in 1776, generation after generation used those very words to demand something better. When abolitionists argued against slavery, they pointed to the Declaration. When women demanded the right to vote, they pointed to the Declaration. When civil rights leaders marched through the streets of America, they pointed to the Declaration. Again and again, Americans look back at that single sentence. All men are created equal. Not as proof that the work was finished, but as proof that the work still mattered. Perhaps that's one of the greatest strengths of this country. Its founding ideas have always challenged it to become better than it was yesterday. Not perfect, just better. The people who built America, history books, love extraordinary people. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Edison, the Wright Brothers, Neil Armstrong, Martin Luther King Jr., Susan B. Anthony, Franklin Roosevelt. They deserve every page written about them. But I've always believed the real story of America belongs to the people whose names we'll never know. A coal miner who spent 30 years underground so his children could go to college. A farmer who never became famous, but fed thousands of families. The immigrant who stepped off a ship carrying one suitcase and spent the rest of his life building a small business that eventually employed half the town. The teacher who convinced a struggling child not to quit. The firefighter who ran towards danger while everyone else ran away. The nurse who stayed long after her shift ended because one patient still needed someone to hold their hand. The police officer who missed another holiday dinner because someone had to answer the call. The truck driver crossing America tonight while most of us are asleep. The factory worker, the machinist, the carpenter, the electrician, the waitress, the scientist, the software engineer, the volunteer coach, the pastor, the mechanic, the 911 dispatcher, the military family counting the days until someone comes home. These people rarely appear in documentaries. There are no monuments built in their honor, no chapters in history books. Yet without them, there is no America. Because nations aren't built by famous people. They're built by millions of ordinary people quietly doing extraordinary things every single day. People often ask, what makes America different? Some will point to the Constitution, others to free speech, others to opportunity. All of those matter. But I think the answer is something even simpler. America has never been defined by blood, or ancestry, or tribe. From the beginning, it has been defined by an idea. An idea that people from completely different backgrounds, speaking different languages, practicing different faiths, could become one people. That idea hasn't always been easy. It hasn't always been successful. But it remains one of the boldest experiments in human history. Think about the millions of people who have crossed oceans seeking a chance to begin again. Think about the people that come from Cuba to Florida. Think about the people, the hundreds of people that try to cross borders in South Texas because they believe we're the greatest country on earth. Irish families escaping famine. Jewish families fleeing persecution. Italians searching for work. Chinese laborers helping build the railroads. Mexican families seeking opportunity. Vietnamese refugees. People from India, Korea, Africa, East Europe, South America, the Middle East. Every single one of them adding another thread to the American story. Our national motto isn't just printed on coins. E pluribus unum. Out of many, one. That's never meant everyone should become the same. It means that despite our differences, we choose to build something together. The greatest generation, and every generation. When people hear the phrase, the greatest generation, they often think about, of those who fought World War II, or Vietnam, or World War I. And rightly so. But every generation has faced moments history placed squarely on its shoulders. The generation that declared independence, the generation that preserved the Union, the generation that crossed the Atlantic to liberate Europe, the generation that landed on the moon. Each inherited challenges they didn't choose. Each left behind a country different than the one they inherited. Now, it's our turn. The problems are different. The technology is different. The world is different. But the responsibility hasn't changed. History has handed us the same question it handed every generation before us. What kind of America will we leave behind? 250 years. Think about everything that's happened. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Louisiana Purchase, the Lewis and Clark Expedition, the abolition of slavery, the Statue of Liberty, the Golden Gate Bridge, the Wright Brothers, the Hoover Dam, the Civil Rights Movement, the Interstate Highway System, Apollo 11, the Internet, medical breakthroughs that have saved millions of lives. Each generation added another chapter. Not because history demanded it, because ordinary Americans choose to write it. One day, people 250 years from now will look back at us. They'll study our choices, our successes, our failures, our courage, our mistakes, just as we have looked back tonight. One question isn't whether history will remember us. It will. The one question is, what story will it tell? America is 250 years old. That's an extraordinary sentence. Empires have risen and fallen. Kingdoms have vanished. Borders have changed. Entire civilizations have disappeared into history. Yet this remarkable experiment, born from 56 signatures in a hot Philadelphia summer, continues. Not because it has been perfect, not because it has been easy, but because generation after generation has believed this nation was worth improving, worth protecting, worth passing on. George Washington is gone. Thomas Jefferson is gone. Abraham Lincoln is gone. The soldiers who stormed Normandy are almost all gone. The astronauts who walked on the moon are becoming history themselves. Their chapter has been written. Now, the pen has been handed to us. Every generation inherits America. No generation owns her. We borrow her for a little while, and then we pass her on to our children. Hopefully a little wiser, hopefully a little stronger, hopefully a little closer to the extraordinary promise made on July 4th. The Declaration of Independence wasn't the finish line. It was the first page. Tonight, during these first hours of America's 250th birthday, that story is still being written. And tomorrow morning, when the sun rises over the nation, the next chapter begins. Happy birthday, America. May we always be worthy of the freedoms we've inherited, the sacrifices that secured them, and the responsibilities that come with them. Thank you for spending the historic Independence Day with me here in the den. I'm Dravin. And until next time, keep looking for the stories hidden between the dates. Good night. God bless you. God bless the United States of America.